I parked my car in the same spot I had been using for years, right in front of the old hardware store at the corner of Oak Street. It wasn't just any parking spot. It was my parking spot. I knew the town rules inside and out, and I had never once been ticketed, towed, or even warned about parking there. The spot wasn't blocking traffic, wasn't in front of a fire hydrant, and definitely wasn't part of any restricted zone. But that morning, as I stepped out of the store with a fresh cup of coffee and a box of nails, my heart nearly stopped. A tow truck was already backing up to my car, and standing beside it was none other than Sheriff Donnelly, the man who had made my life a nightmare more times than I could count. I had never liked Donnelly. He wasn't the kind of sheriff who kept the peace, he was the kind who enjoyed throwing his weight around. The man was built like an aging football player, with a gut that stretched his belt to its limits and a permanent smirk that screamed arrogance. He had been after me ever since I called him out at the town hall meeting last year for trying to raise parking enforcement fees without anyone voting on it. I knew exactly what this was. Payback. I stayed calm, sipping my coffee as the tow truck's metal arms clamped around my tires. Donnelly turned just in time to see me watching, and that smirk of his widened. Well. Looks like someone forgot to read the new town ordinance, he said, folding his arms like he had just won the lottery. New ordinance? I raised an eyebrow. He tapped the laminated paper stuck to a nearby pole. Sure enough, there it was, no parking, towing enforced by order of the sheriff's department. But something was off. That sign hadn't been there yesterday. Hell, it didn't even look official. The town never installed laminated signs, they always used metal ones. And more importantly, only the town council could change parking rules, not the sheriff. That's funny, I said, pretending to inspect the sign. I was here just yesterday, and this wasn't up. And I don't remember this spot ever being restricted. Did the town vote on this? Donnelly's smirk flickered, just for a second. Doesn't matter. The sign's up now, and your car's getting towed. Maybe next time, you'll follow the rules like everybody else. I wasn't about to let this go. I set my coffee down on the hood of a nearby truck and pulled out my phone. You know, Donnelly, I've always been curious about how town ordinances are passed. So let's just check the official town records and see when this new parking rule was approved. I opened the public records website, scrolling through the most recent updates. Nothing. No mention of a new ordinance, no meeting notes, nothing even close to a parking restriction. Donnelly's smirk was gone now, replaced by an impatient glare. You think you're real smart, don't you? He grumbled. I don't think, Donnelly, I said, holding up my phone. I know. And I know for a fact that you can't just make up rules because you don't like someone. That's called abuse of power. But Donnelly wasn't backing down. He pulled out a thick leather-bound ticket book and started scribbling. You can argue all you want, but you're still getting a citation for illegal parking. That's a $250 fine, plus the tow fee. I took a step closer, lowering my voice. You're making a mistake. Donnelly barely glanced up. Yeah? And what are you gonna do about it? I smiled. Oh, you'll see. Because what Donnelly didn't know was that I had a surprise of my own waiting for him. And when he found out, his whole world was about to come crashing down. I didn't waste another second arguing with Donnelly. I had learned long ago that men like him never back down when confronted, they only doubled down. But that was fine because I already had everything I needed to turn this situation around. As the tow truck lifted my car off the ground, I stepped back and hit a few buttons on my phone. The moment I did, I saw exactly what I expected, Donnelly's smug expression faltering just a little as he noticed me watching with too much confidence. I had installed a GPS tracker and a remote kill switch in my car months ago, a little security feature I had added after a string of car thefts in town. While Donnelly thought he was getting away with his little stunt, I was already setting up my counterattack. The tow truck driver pulled away from the curb, heading straight for the impound lot on the other side of town, but my car wouldn't be getting far. I turned on my heel and walked towards City Hall, pushing through the heavy double doors and straight into the office of the town clerk, a woman named Nancy who had been working in local government longer than I had been alive. Nancy knew everything about town regulations, and more importantly, she hated Donnelly. I barely had to explain the situation before she was already shaking her head, rifling through a thick stack of papers on her desk. She didn't even need to look up at me as she spoke, her voice dripping with irritation. That man thinks he owns this town. He doesn't have the authority to change parking regulations, and he sure as hell doesn't have the authority to put up a fake sign without council approval. Give me a second. She pulled a thick binder from a nearby filing cabinet, flipping through the pages before stopping on the exact record I needed. Here, she said, jabbing a finger at the document. Last official meeting, no mention of new parking laws. The last traffic update was 5 months ago, and that was just repainting faded road markings. This no parking nonsense? It's not official. He made it up. That was all I needed. I snapped a photo of the document, thanked Nancy, and marched straight out the door. I wasn't going to confront Donnelly just yet, I needed to make sure my plan unfolded perfectly. I pulled out my phone again, opened the GPS tracking app linked to my car, and activated the kill switch. Within seconds, my car came to a dead stop in the middle of the road, right in the path of oncoming traffic. I knew exactly where the tow truck was because the tracker was updating in real time. It had just turned onto Main Street, the busiest road in town, when my car suddenly shut down. I could only imagine the look on Donnelly's face when he realized his little power trip had just turned into a full-scale traffic disaster. I was already heading toward the scene, walking slowly, taking my time because I wanted to enjoy every second of this. When I arrived, the sight was even better than I had hoped. My car was stuck right in the middle of the road, the tow truck driver standing beside it with his hands on his hips, shouting into his phone. Horns blared from behind him as impatient drivers stuck in the traffic jam leaned out of their windows, demanding to know what was going on. And then there was Donnelly, standing off to the side, looking more furious than I had ever seen him. The man was sweating, his face red, his fists clenched. I couldn't stop the smirk that spread across my face as I strolled up to him, hands in my pockets, taking my sweet time. "Something wrong, Sheriff?" I asked, tilting my head slightly, my tone dripping with false concern. He turned toward me so fast I thought he might snap his own neck. His jaw was clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitching. "What the hell did you do?" he hissed under his breath, but he kept his voice low, as if he didn't want the growing crowd of onlookers to hear. That was a mistake. Because I wanted them to hear. I wanted everyone to see exactly what kind of man Donnelly really was. I pulled out my phone and waved it in front of him. "Just checking my GPS tracker. Looks like my car had a little mechanical failure. Funny how that works, huh?" His nostrils flared as he took a step closer, towering over me, trying to intimidate me, but I didn't flinch. "You think this is funny?" he growled, barely keeping his composure. "You're interfering with law enforcement. That's a serious offense." I chuckled at that, shaking my head as I took another step back, making sure I was standing where the gathering crowd could see me clearly. "Oh, I don't think it's funny, Donnelly. I think it's hilarious. Because while you were busy abusing your power, you forgot one very important detail: you don't have the legal authority to tow my car in the first place." That did it. The second those words left my mouth, I saw the shift in the crowd. People started murmuring, whispering to each other, and I knew that the town's gossip mill was already kicking into high gear. One of the drivers stuck in traffic shouted, "Is that true?" Another one followed up with, "You can't just make up rules, Donnelly." The sheriff's face went from red to pale in seconds. He knew he was in trouble. I decided to twist the knife a little deeper. "Oh, and just so we're clear," I continued, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I already checked with the town clerk. There's no record of a new parking ordinance. That sign you put up? Completely fake. Which means this tow? Illegal." Donnelly's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He was cornered, and he knew it. The tow truck driver looked between us, then back at my car, then back at Donnelly, and slowly, he unhooked my vehicle. The second my tires hit the ground, the crowd cheered. Donnelly turned on him immediately. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he barked, but the driver just shrugged, wiping the sweat off his forehead. "I don't get paid enough for this, man. If the tow's illegal, I'm not getting sued over it." I stepped forward, patting my car like it was an old friend. "That's right. And speaking of lawsuits." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the final piece of my plan, a legal notice I had already prepared in case Donnelly ever tried something like this. "I'd start preparing your defense, Sheriff. Because you just violated multiple laws, including abuse of power and unlawful towing. And trust me." I grinned as I placed the notice right into his shaking hands. "I'm going to enjoy watching you try to weasel your way out of this one." The crowd was already pulling out their phones, snapping pictures, recording videos, talking loudly about how Donnelly had finally been caught. His reputation, his authority, his entire sense of control, it was all crumbling around him. And I wasn't done yet. Because what Donnelly didn't realize was that this was only the beginning. Donnelly stood frozen, gripping the legal notice so tightly his knuckles turned white. The weight of the situation was sinking in, and he knew he had just stepped into something he couldn't easily get out of. The crowd around us wasn't just watching anymore, they were actively participating, taking pictures, recording videos, and openly questioning how the sheriff thought he could get away with something like this. Donnelly had built his entire reputation on intimidation, on making people too afraid to challenge him, but today was different. Today, he wasn't the one in control, I was. And I wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. I turned back to my car, carefully inspecting the damage. The tow truck's hooks had left deep scratches along the bumper, the undercarriage looked scraped, and I wasn't about to let that slide. I pulled out my phone again, this time snapping pictures of the damage from every angle. If Donnelly thought this was going to go away quietly, he was dead wrong. I wasn't just going to embarrass him, I was going to make sure there were real, legal consequences for what he had done. The second I was done taking photos, I dialed my insurance company. I made sure to speak loud enough for everyone to hear. Yes, my car was illegally towed. Yes, I have photographic evidence. Yes, I'll be filing a claim for damages, and yes, I'll be forwarding all footage to my lawyer. Donnelly's face darkened as I spoke, but I could see it in his eyes, he knew there was nothing he could do about it. And then, just when I thought this moment couldn't get any better, something even more satisfying happened. A black SUV pulled up to the scene, and out stepped Mayor Richardson. Now, the mayor and I weren't exactly friends, but we had one thing in common, we both hated Donnelly. The mayor had been trying to find a reason to get rid of him for years, but Donnelly had always been just careful enough to avoid outright corruption charges. That changed today. The second Richardson laid eyes on the scene, my car, the illegally placed sign, the tow truck still idling on the street, his expression hardened. The mayor wasted no time getting involved. He walked straight up to Donnelly, arms crossed, voice low but firm. "Tell me, Sheriff," he said, and though I couldn't hear his exact words, I could see the way Donnelly stiffened. Whatever Richardson was saying, it was not in his favor. The mayor pulled out his phone, typing something, then gestured for one of his aides to step forward. A younger man in a suit handed him a stack of documents, which Richardson immediately flipped through. Then, in one swift motion, he handed them to Donnelly. I couldn't see what was written on them, but I didn't need to. The look of absolute defeat on Donnelly's face told me everything I needed to know. I could feel the tension shifting. The crowd, once a collection of onlookers, was now completely against Donnelly. People weren't just whispering anymore, they were openly questioning how long he had been pulling stunts like this, how many people had been victims of his made-up rules. A woman near the front spoke up. "He gave me a parking ticket last week for being 3 inches outside the line." Another man chimed in, "He towed my wife's car from a legal space and told her to fight it in court." The murmurs grew louder, more and more people coming forward with their own stories. The truth was finally spilling out. Then, as if the universe wanted to put the final nail in Donnelly's coffin, another car pulled up. This time, it was a state investigator. I almost laughed. I had made one phone call to the state's attorney's office while walking to City Hall earlier, just to ask if it was legal for a sheriff to enforce made-up parking rules. Apparently, someone in their office had taken my question very seriously, because now, standing before Donnelly, was a man in a dark suit flashing an official badge. The investigator didn't waste any time. He gestured toward the laminated sign, the tow truck, the still-running body cams of several officers who had shown up to control the crowd. "Sheriff Donnelly," he said, "we need to have a conversation. Right now." Donnelly had no choice but to follow him to the side, where the investigator started firing off questions. The sheriff's face grew redder and redder with each passing second. He had been caught red-handed, and everyone knew it. More importantly, he knew it. The days of him operating unchecked, treating the town like his personal kingdom, were over. He tried to argue, tried to push back, but the investigator wasn't having any of it. I could see Donnelly glancing around, looking for support, but there was none. Not a single person in the crowd was on his side. Then came the moment I had been waiting for, the moment Donnelly realized he had lost. His shoulders slumped, his face fell, and for the first time in all the years I had known him, he looked small. The investigator turned away and started making notes on a clipboard. The mayor spoke with one of his aides, then nodded toward me. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just going to be an internal review. This was bigger. The tow truck driver, clearly realizing he wanted no part of this mess, quickly packed up and left. The sign Donnelly had put up. The investigator pulled it down himself, shaking his head in disbelief. The mayor looked at the crowd, then at me, and nodded. "We'll take it from here," he said. And just like that, it was over. I leaned against my car, watching as Donnelly was led toward a squad car, not in handcuffs, not yet, but under enough scrutiny that I knew his time as sheriff was finished. The crowd slowly started dispersing, but the damage to Donnelly's reputation was permanent. He wasn't walking away from this. This wasn't something he could bully his way out of. The town had turned against him, and there was no coming back. As I slid into the driver's seat and started my car, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. Donnelly had tried to take something from me today, my car, my money, my dignity. Instead, he had lost everything. I pulled away from the scene, but I knew the story was just beginning. By tomorrow morning, everyone in town would be talking about what happened. And by the end of the week, there wouldn't be a single person left who didn't know the truth. But the best part? I wasn't done with him yet. I drove home that afternoon knowing that what had just happened was only the beginning. Sheriff Donnelly had spent years throwing his weight around, bullying people into submission, and getting away with it. But today, I had done what no one else had dared, I had publicly humiliated him. That alone would have been enough for most people, but I wasn't most people. I wanted to make sure Donnelly didn't just lose face. I wanted to make sure he lost everything. Because men like him didn't stop until they were forced to. And that was exactly what I planned to do. By the time I got home, my phone was already blowing up. Neighbors, friends, even people I barely spoke to in town were reaching out. Some wanted to congratulate me, others wanted to share their own stories about Donnelly's corruption. One man told me how Donnelly had impounded his motorcycle over a supposed noise violation that didn't exist. Another woman mentioned that he had forced her son to pay a ticket for loitering when all the kid had been doing was waiting for a ride after school. It was a pattern. Donnelly had spent years inventing laws that didn't exist, fining people who couldn't afford to fight back, and pocketing the money through shady town loopholes. And now, it was all coming to the surface. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, combing through the town's financial records. Most people didn't know that the county's budget and expense reports were publicly available if you knew where to look. I wasn't an expert, but I had enough common sense to see when things didn't add up. And sure enough, they didn't add up. Donnelly had been collecting thousands of dollars in administrative fees tied to parking violations, fines, and vehicle impoundments. But the money wasn't showing up in the official budget reports. Where was it going? I kept digging. Line by line, report by report. And then I found it. A separate account, listed under miscellaneous enforcement expenses. The number attached to it was staggering, over $200,000 in unexplained revenue over the last 5 years. And the account? It was linked directly to an office managed by Donnelly's department. This wasn't just petty corruption anymore. This was embezzlement. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but from excitement. I had just found the smoking gun. And now, all I had to do was make sure it landed in the right hands. The next morning, I didn't waste any time. I forwarded everything I had to the state investigator who had questioned Donnelly the day before. I knew they were already looking into him, but this was concrete evidence. I attached a note explaining how I had found the discrepancies, included links to the town's own financial records, and even highlighted the exact sections that needed reviewing. Then, just for good measure, I copied the local news station. Within an hour, my phone rang. It was the investigator. His voice was calm, but I could tell he was impressed. "We'll be escalating this immediately," he said. That was all I needed to hear. I knew what that meant. Donnelly was no longer just facing public embarrassment, he was now under criminal investigation. I wasn't the only one who knew something was happening. By mid-afternoon, the entire town was buzzing. Whispers were turning into conversations. Conversations were turning into outright accusations. People were demanding answers. The town council was scrambling. And Donnelly? He had disappeared. For a man who usually strutted around town like he owned the place, it was strange to see him suddenly nowhere to be found. His patrol car wasn't outside the station. His office was locked. And when someone tried to call him, they were met with silence. That silence didn't last long. Around 5 p.m., a convoy of black SUVs rolled into town. Federal agents. When they stepped out, carrying folders, radios, and search warrants, the message was clear: this wasn't just a local issue anymore. This was bigger. And Donnelly? Well, he must have known it too, because an hour later, a call went out over the police scanner. Sheriff Donnelly was missing. I laughed when I heard the news. The big, bad sheriff, the man who spent years intimidating people, shaking them down for fines, making up his own rules, he had run. He had grabbed whatever cash he could and vanished. But what he didn't know was that he had nowhere to hide. Because while the feds were combing through his office, I was busy making sure he was found. I had guessed from the start that a man like Donnelly wouldn't have a legal escape plan. He wouldn't have the brains to cover his tracks. So I did the simplest thing imaginable. I tracked his credit card. It wasn't hard. All it took was a friend who worked at the local gas station, someone who hated Donnelly just as much as I did. When I asked if he had seen anything unusual, he nodded. Yeah, the sheriff was here an hour ago. Paid in cash. Looked nervous. That was all I needed. I called the investigator immediately. He's on the move. Check the surveillance tapes. It didn't take long. By nightfall, they had footage of Donnelly at an ATM, withdrawing what little cash he had left before speeding out of town. The feds moved fast. Roadblocks were set up on every highway. His face was plastered all over the news. And then, just as the night settled in, they got him. Donnelly was caught 3 counties over, trying to check into a cheap motel under a fake name. It was over. His reign of corruption, his abuse of power, his entire career, it was done. He was dragged out in cuffs, his mugshot flashed across every local news station. And the best part? I was there to see it. The town gathered outside the station that night, watching as the once untouchable sheriff was led inside, his head down, his face pale. The same people he had bullied, ticketed, and stolen from were now cheering. The world had finally seen Donnelly for what he was, a fraud. A coward. A man who thought he could make up rules and never face consequences. But today, he did. Today, the people won. I walked home that night feeling lighter than I had in years. I had set out to stop Donnelly from towing my car, but in the end, I had taken down an entire corrupt system. And that, I thought, was the kind of victory that was worth every second. The morning after Donnelly's arrest, the town was practically buzzing with energy. The man who had spent years terrorizing people, slapping them with fake tickets, and making up laws had been caught like a common criminal. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, people weren't afraid anymore. They were celebrating. I drove into town early, just to see it for myself. The usual tension that had always lingered in the air, like people were walking on eggshells, waiting for Donnelly to pull another stunt, was gone. People were smiling, talking freely, shaking hands, as if some invisible weight had been lifted off their shoulders. I stopped at the local diner for coffee, and the moment I stepped inside, I was greeted with applause. At first, I didn't know how to react. I wasn't used to being the center of attention, but apparently, my role in taking Donnelly down had spread like wildfire. People had seen me stand up to him. They had seen me expose his fake parking rules, his illegal towing scam, and his stolen money. Now, I was the guy who ended the reign of the town's most corrupt sheriff. "Drinks on the house," the owner called out, grinning as she handed me a fresh cup of coffee. I could see people nudging each other, whispering, some even coming up to shake my hand. It was surreal. The same people who used to keep their heads down when they saw Donnelly's patrol car were now openly mocking him. Someone had even taped a "parking rules approved by Sheriff Donnelly" sign to the front of the diner, except it was handwritten and full of ridiculous, fake rules, like "no parking unless your last name is Donnelly" and "park at your own risk, because Donnelly makes up the laws." I sat down at my usual booth and pulled out my phone. The news had already caught on. Headlines like, "Corrupt Sheriff Busted After Years of Abuse" and "Small-Town Hero Exposes Embezzlement Scheme" were everywhere. And the best part? People weren't just talking about the parking scam anymore. They were digging deeper. It turned out Donnelly had stolen way more than just parking fines. Over the years, he had padded his pockets with illegal asset forfeitures, seizing cars, property, and cash under the pretense of investigations that never went anywhere. He had been running a racket, taking people's things and forcing them to pay fines to get them back. Some folks never even saw their money or property again. And now, all of it was coming out. By noon, more officials had arrived in town. Investigators were pulling records from the sheriff's office. Forensic accountants were going through every financial transaction tied to Donnelly, trying to figure out where all the missing money had gone. They had already uncovered shell accounts, fake invoices, and entire budgets that had been tampered with. And then, the biggest bombshell of all dropped. One of the investigators held a press conference, standing outside the sheriff's office, reading from a prepared statement. Sheriff Donnelly is now facing multiple charges, including embezzlement, fraud, falsification of public records, and abuse of power. The total amount of stolen funds is estimated to be over $500,000. I nearly choked on my coffee. $500,000? I had suspected Donnelly was corrupt, but I never imagined it ran that deep. The press was eating it up. News vans were parked all along Main Street, interviewing residents, getting statements, digging for dirt. Some of them even approached me, asking for details about how I had exposed him. I gave them the simplest answer I could. All I did was refuse to be bullied. That was the truth. I hadn't set out to expose a major corruption scandal. I had just wanted to stop Donnelly from illegally towing my car. But once I started pulling on the thread, the entire thing unraveled. And now? Donnelly wasn't just done in this town, he was done, period. Later that evening, I got a call from the state attorney's office. They wanted to personally thank me for coming forward with the evidence. If you hadn't found those financial records and tipped us off, this case might have taken years to crack, the investigator told me. You just saved us a lot of time. I didn't know what to say. It still didn't feel real. In the span of just a few days, I had gone from being just another guy in town to being the reason the most powerful man in our community had fallen. And as much as I wanted to enjoy the victory, I knew this fight wasn't completely over. Donnelly's arrest had left a power vacuum. The town was suddenly without a sheriff, and while some people were relieved, others were panicking. The city council had called an emergency meeting to discuss who would take over. Normally, there would be an election, but with Donnelly's corruption case still unfolding, things were complicated. That night, I attended the meeting just to see how things would shake out. The community center was packed, people standing shoulder to shoulder, everyone eager to have a say. And that's when something happened that I never saw coming. One of the council members stood up, cleared his throat, and said, "I think we all know who should take over as sheriff until we can hold an election. The person who had the courage to stand up to corruption when no one else would. The person who took down Donnelly and exposed the truth." And then, just like that, they said my name. I sat there, stunned, as the room erupted in cheers. People were chanting my name. Clapping. Nodding. Someone even stood up and yelled, "We need someone we can actually trust." I had never in my life thought about working in law enforcement. Never imagined wearing a badge or being in charge of anything. But in that moment, surrounded by the people I had unknowingly fought for, I realized something. This town didn't need another Donnelly. It needed someone who understood what it felt like to be on the receiving end of corruption. Someone who wasn't in it for power, but for justice. And maybe, just maybe, that someone was me.